As a progressive community committed to peace and justice, we try to look honestly at what's going on in the world, in our own communities, and in our own hearts. We're oriented around ethics and praxis, and we ask questions like, how does this change how we understand the world and ourselves? And how can we cultivate kindness, compassion, and justice? Now, those have never been particularly easy questions anywhere, especially not in a place like the Ozarks. And each of us have to decide what we can do and what we can't do. Sometimes we even come to different conclusions, but we do our best to keep listening, to keep learning, to keep changing. It's hard work, and that's why we gather together as a community to encourage each other to keep going. And what I felt inside of myself and what I've heard from many others is that's increasingly difficult. The polarization in the United States and in many other places has combined with pandemic fatigue. A lot of us are worn out. That polarization is nothing new, and marginalized communities have especially been harmed by it through the years. The history of the United States can't be separated from the history of people in power dehumanizing entire populations and then using that hatred and bigotry to help tolerate or even justify exploitation and violence. You know the list: slavery, genocide and violent displacement of indigenous peoples, exploitation of immigrants, Jim Crow segregation and mass incarceration, patriarchal violence and the gender gap, neglect and abuse of elderly and disabled folks, violence and discrimination against gender and sexuality minorities, class warfare, social disparities, and more. But the last years have seen a deepening fracture, even for a nation that was essentially built on fractured lives and histories. Surveys by the Pew Research Center before the 2020 election showed that about 80% of voters, no matter what their political affiliation, said that their difference with the other side were about core American values. Not just some surface thing that they could overlook pretty easily, but at the very heart of what they understood about life. And about 90%, again, from any political affiliation, worried that a victory by the other would lead to lasting harm to the United States. Honestly, that's not too surprising. I kind of felt that way, kind of still feel that way myself. It's hard to imagine feeling otherwise, especially when so much of the rhetoric aimed at marginalized groups is so exuberantly dehumanizing, and especially when hate crimes and bullying continue to rise. It's not an exaggeration to say that there are a significant number of people who hate us and consider us enemies. And it's important to acknowledge that we, too, can hate and dehumanize others in turn. The ethical questions that come to us are also nothing new. In such a situation, how can we be people who love ourselves, who love each other, who even love those who hate us? How do we respond to hatred and division? And having been deeply hurt by others, how do we love in a way that break those cycles of harm? And that last question was the most pressing one for me, especially as a young person growing up in a conservative Christian tradition. That saying by Jesus was especially confusing when he said in Luke 6, "But I say to you who listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Do to others as you would have them do to you." Those words were at once lovely and horrifying to me. It was easy enough to know who at least some of my enemies were, but what did it mean to love them? What did it mean to pray for someone who had abused me? What did that mean for me? Was this an indirect confirmation of what I had absorbed in my religious surroundings growing up, that I had somehow deserved abuse? Was turning the cheek part of some punishment, something I deserved for being a genderqueer, bisexual kid? My teenage self struggled to make sense of it all and decided against it. If that was what Jesus meant, I wouldn't have any part of it. Don't get me wrong, I was a true believer, and I coped largely by clinging to the emphasis on peace and justice in the messages of Jesus and the prophets. It was clear that speaking up against oppression was something that could and should be done, and I could follow their examples in whatever ways made sense in my life. But it was the Sermon on the Mount. It still lingered with that difficult word about loving my enemies. I wanted to love everyone. If for no other reason, I wanted to be able to love myself. And, hatred made that pretty difficult. And as a true believer, I wanted to be able to take Jesus' words seriously in a way that made sense. I was about 20 years old, just beginning to understand all the work involved with healing my own personal trauma, let alone how to engage with the larger suffering of the wider world. And that is what I was wrestling with in life when I first encountered the works of Walter Wink and learned a new way to understand what it meant to unlearn hatred and maybe even love my enemies. To begin, Wink's voice was immediately relatable. He said, "When I took a long look at all the violence and rage within me, I found I had a tremendous amount of work to do. If we can't deal with our own personal violence, how can we expect to deal with the violence of nations?" And that was my own situation. I felt rage and despair in my own heart, both for my suffering and for the suffering of others. And I felt powerless, especially since my childhood religious tradition didn't offer a clear way to heal. Wink also put that into words. He criticized popular understandings of turning the other cheek as an invitation to endure mistreatment like a doormat, to be cowardly and complicit in the face of injustice. That possibility felt even more explicit in Matthew's version of these verses, with the addition of, "If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile." Growing up, going the 2nd mile just meant to put my needs last and not hold it against someone who took advantage of me. Wink pointed out that that kind of interpretation could even lead to collaboration with an oppressor. Later, this possibility was vividly described by a friend of mine who told me she had been taught that this verse growing up was an encouragement to be kind to the poor, overworked soldier who just needed a helping hand, with never a word that he represented both the violent, cruel occupation of Jesus' homeland or the symbolic power of Roman imperial and dehumanizing might. Further, Wink put my own rejection of those interpretations into words that I could recognize. He said, Jesus' teaching viewed this way is impractical, masochistic, even suicidal, an invitation to bullies and spouse batterers to wipe up the floor with their supine Christian victims. For me, turning the other cheek was functionally inseparable from looking the other way. It was the powerful's way of guilting us into silence and inaction. It protected their power by helping keep us in check in what Wink called the natural reaction to being slapped, sued, or forced to carry a soldier's pack, which was quite obviously irritation, outrage, or violence. He said the structure of violence is quite simple. Do unto others as they have done unto you. That last insight showed me where I have been caught. The structure of violence is simple. Do unto others as they have done unto you. I could feel the power of outrage and anger inside of me. And sometimes it felt really good. Sometimes I think it kept me alive. It was a protective force. But I could also feel that it could consume me. By itself, I would just repeat the harm that I had received. I would enter into that same cycle and likely hurt others in a similar way, if not the same way that I had been hurt. I could feel that trap. Fight back and become like those who harmed me, or do nothing and allow myself and others to get hurt again and again. Wink offered an alternative that opened up a way to stay grounded in goodwill without giving up to the demands of oppressors. Although Wink's work on this subject has now been around for at least 3 decades, I first encountered it in Engaging the Powers, which was published in 1992. I still meet enough people who are unfamiliar with these ideas that I think it's worthwhile to repeat them again today. His books go into much greater detail on the historical, cultural, and linguistic context that support his conclusions, which are not without controversy. And I'm just offering these ideas here more as an introduction. In the case of turning the other cheek, the setup is that the first blow would be a backhanded strike, the back of the right hand striking the other person's right cheek. The point was less to cause physical injury than it was to cause psychological injury, to humiliate and degrade, to insert a person back into their social role, Wink put it, as an inferior. He suggested that this was a common method for those in positions of power, masters, husbands, parents, Roman occupiers, to assert their dominance over the people they considered beneath them. Slaves, wives, children, occupied Jews. In this way, the power structures could be reinforced through humiliating, degrading, and dehumanizing the marginalized. The whole point, Wink taught, was to force someone who was out of line to get back in line. But when you turn the other cheek, backhanded slap, that was no longer possible. Wink said, the left cheek now offers a perfect target for a blow of the fist, but only equals fought with fists, as we know from Jewish sources. By turning the cheek, then, the inferior party is saying, I'm not inferior to you. I'm a human being. I refuse to be humiliated by you any longer. I am your equal. A similar dynamic was behind the second example, giving up your shirt. The setup here is a poor person who has been taken to court to collect a debt. We know the person is poor because their only collateral is their outer garment. The Hebrew scriptures in Deuteronomy 24 put a limit on the ability to keep this collateral, requiring that the creditor had to return the cloak before evening so that the poor person could sleep in it and not risk exposure during the night. But Palestine in the first century was overflowing with economic injustice, supported and encouraged by Roman imperialism. With the system set against them, a poor person in debt had little hope, with nothing left but the clothes on their backs to use against the system, to turn the system against itself. By offering their inner garment, their shirt, effectively their underwear, the poor person turns the shame of this situation against the wealthy and powerful creditor. Wink said, he has said in effect, you want my robe? Here, take everything. Now you've got it all except my body. Is that what you'll take next? Imagine the debtor leaving court naked. His friends and neighbors aghast inquire, what happened? He explains. They join his growing procession, which now resembles a victory parade. This is guerrilla theater, folks. The entire system by which debtors are oppressed has been publicly unmasked. The creditor is revealed to be not a legitimate moneylender, but a party to the reduction of an entire social class to landlessness and destitution. And the third example in Jesus' text, this one from Matthew, is going that extra mile. And the military, as you know, was often on the move across the empire, and Roman law allowed a soldier to impress any person to carry their load. This was no small requirement, as packs often weighed 60 to 85 pounds, plus weapons. Some higher-ranking soldiers had slaves or donkeys to do this work, but forced labor of subjugated people was, in Wink's words, a constant feature in Palestine from Persian to late Roman times. He reported that this compulsory service was so despised that at times a whole village might flee in front of an incoming Roman platoon to avoid being forced to carry that kind of baggage. However, it seemed that even the empire recognized the physical limits of human beings and said you could only carry that gear 1 mile. A soldier who compelled a person to carry baggage more than a mile could be subject to a centurion's discipline, from paying a fine to receiving a flogging. So what would a soldier do if a person refused to give up the pack and went a second mile? Wink said, "From a situation of servile impressment, the oppressed have once more seized the initiative. They've taken back the power of choice. They've thrown the soldier off balance by depriving him of the predictability of his victim's response. Now he must make a decision for which nothing in his previous experience has prepared him." Jesus does not encourage Jews to walk the second mile in order to build up merit in heaven or to be pious or to kill soldiers with kindness. Rather, he is helping an oppressed people to find a way to protest and neutralize an onerous practice despised throughout the empire. As a student of biblical studies, I'm aware of the arguments over the legitimacy of Wink's exegetical conclusions. Those discussions are interesting and even important, but as a student of my own heart, what was and is important to me was finding a pathway out of that trap I mentioned earlier. Fight back and become like those who had harmed me, or do nothing and allow myself and others to get hurt again and again. Wink's alternative approach to both Jesus' words and, more generally, to breaking the cycle of violence made sense of, provided a vocabulary for, and pointed toward some practical skills to deal with what I was going through in my life and what I witnessed in the world. And that is the understanding I took with me into the broader world as an activist, teacher, peace worker, and pastor. Wink also pointed out that these were just examples, not rules to be followed in a rigid way. And in fact, they might only be effective once or twice, since oppressive systems have proved to be remarkably adaptable over time. The examples then are meant to spark our imaginations and give us confidence that we can respond to difficult situations in a way that exposes injustice, recovers our own agency, asserts our humanity, and also provides the enemy with an opportunity to join us in transformation. And that last point is how these creative acts of resistance relate to loving our enemy. Hating our enemy and responding violently, that dehumanizes the other, while passively accepting oppression dehumanizes ourselves. Creative resistance allows me to respond with goodwill, without demeaning myself or demeaning the other. It provides a space for change to happen, to break out of those patterns of hatred and violence that we have been born into. At least for me, unlearning hatred for my enemies became part of setting me free to love myself and to love my community. All the energy that hatred and despair was burning through, if I gave that up, I could receive that energy back as a gift and then share it with others who had also been wounded and marginalized. As Bell Hooks wrote, "Without changing structures of domination, we leave in place the culture of lovelessness. Love is profoundly political. Our deepest revolution will come when we understand this truth. Only love can give us the strength to go forward in the midst of heartbreak and misery. Only love can give us the power to reconcile, to redeem, the power to renew weary spirits and save lost souls. The transformative power of love is the foundation of all meaningful social change. Without love, our lives are without meaning. Love is the heart of the matter. When all else has fallen away, love sustains." Over the years, I've found other words and other paths and tools to help me heal from trauma, resist oppression, and build community where solidarity, justice, and joy are the norms instead of the exceptions. But in many ways, my journey started here with Jesus and Walter Wink. This is where I learned that it was possible to love even amid hate and break the cycle of violence in my own heart, even if it was not broken anywhere else. That hope and commitment put me in touch with a long history of people forming just and compassionate communities in the face of hatred and oppression, and continues to carry me through life today. So whatever path we've taken to get here, I'm convinced that this is the way forward, and I'm glad to walk it with you. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.